Excuse me, sir. That is not what you meant to say in Mandarin. The sentence floated across the quiet dining room so calmly that for a moment nobody realized how dangerous it was. Silverware stopped moving. A crystal glass paused halfway to a man's lips. At the center table beneath a chandelier that glowed like warm sunlight, the wealthy businessman Richard Whitmore slowly turned his head toward the voice. Just seconds earlier, he had been speaking Mandarin to his overseas partner, confident that nobody around them could understand a single word. He had spoken freely, even arrogantly, commenting on the staff, the service, and the quiet black maid polishing the edge of a marble counter nearby. The restaurant itself was one of the most expensive in Manhattan, a place where every chair was hand-stitched leather and every plate arrived like a piece of art. Naomi Carter had been working there for 3 weeks, mostly unnoticed, moving silently between tables with a cloth and a tray. To the guests, she was invisible. To the manager Daniel Brooks, she was simply another employee who should stay out of sight and never interrupt a paying millionaire. Yet now every pair of eyes in the room drifted toward her as the last echoes of her voice settled into the air. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Naomi Carter did not move closer to the table. She remained beside the marble counter, the soft scent of cleaning solution still clinging to the cloth in her hand. The restaurant lights reflected off the polished floor, casting a faint golden glow around her shoes. Daniel Brooks felt a cold wave rush through his chest. In the 5 years he had managed the dining room, he had learned one rule above all others. Never interrupt a powerful client. Yet Naomi had done exactly that, and she had done it in the one language Richard Whitmore had chosen precisely because he believed nobody present could understand it. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair. His expression was not angry at first. It was curious. He studied Naomi the way a chess player studies an unexpected move. Across from him, his business partner from Shanghai frowned slightly, then glanced between them with growing interest. Daniel Brooks hurried forward, forcing a polite smile as panic crept into his voice. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "I believe you should return to your duties." But Naomi Carter did not look at the manager. Her eyes remained on Richard Whitmore. Calm, steady, respectful, yet unafraid. A faint murmur began to ripple through nearby tables as guests sensed that something unusual had just happened. Richard tapped one finger against the table, then switched back to Mandarin, his tone sharper now. Asking a question meant to test whether the maid truly understood the language or had simply repeated a memorized phrase. Naomi listened without blinking. When he finished, she answered again in Mandarin, her pronunciation smooth and precise, the rhythm natural, the vocabulary far beyond what anyone expected from a woman holding a cleaning cloth beside a dining table. The entire room seemed to freeze. Daniel Brooks felt the color drain from his face as he realized the truth. The maid he had barely noticed for weeks had just stepped into a conversation worth millions of dollars, and somehow she sounded like she belonged there. The silence that followed Naomi Carter's answer did not feel normal. It felt heavy, like the air inside the restaurant had suddenly grown thicker. Richard Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing with careful interest rather than anger. Most people in the room still did not understand what had just been said, but they could sense the shift in power the way animals sense a storm before it arrives. The man from Shanghai sitting across from Richard slowly placed his chopsticks down on the plate and looked directly at Naomi. His expression held something close to surprise, but also respect. Daniel Brooks, however, felt his stomach twist into a tight knot. He stepped closer to Naomi, lowering his voice so that only she could hear him. "Naomi, that is enough. Return to the service area immediately." His words carried a forced calm that barely hid the fear underneath. But Naomi Carter remained still, the cleaning cloth folded neatly in her hand. She did not speak again right away. Instead, she waited, her posture calm, her breathing steady, as though she understood something that nobody else in the room had yet realized. Richard Whitmore tapped his finger once against the white linen tablecloth. Then he spoke again in Mandarin, this time much faster, his tone sharper, the vocabulary more technical. It was not casual conversation now. It was the language of business contracts, legal obligations, and financial risk. Daniel Brooks could not understand a single word, but he recognized the look on Richard's face. This was a test. Richard Whitmore was challenging her. Naomi listened without interrupting. When Richard finished speaking, the room held its breath. Then Naomi answered again in Mandarin, her voice calm and precise. She did not rush her words. She explained something about the phrasing of a clause Richard had just mentioned, something subtle hidden inside the wording of the agreement he was discussing with his partner. The man from Shanghai suddenly straightened in his chair. He looked at Richard and spoke quickly in Mandarin, his voice carrying a tone of surprise that even the guests nearby could recognize. Richard turned toward him sharply. For a moment the two men spoke quietly back and forth, their voices low but urgent. Daniel Brooks felt a cold sweat form along the back of his neck. Whatever Naomi had just said had clearly mattered. Richard Whitmore slowly turned his head back toward Naomi. This time there was no arrogance in his expression. Instead there was something else. Curiosity mixed with caution. He switched to English, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Carter, is it?" Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." Richard studied her carefully. "You understood everything we were discussing?" Naomi hesitated for half a second before answering. "Yes, sir. I did." Daniel Brooks nearly dropped the tablet he was holding. Richard leaned back again, his eyes thoughtful now. Then he spoke again in Mandarin, asking another question, but this time the tone was different. It was not a challenge. It was something closer to a request for clarification. Naomi listened and answered once more in the same language, explaining that the clause Richard had mentioned earlier could place full financial liability on his company if the deal moved forward exactly as written. The man from Shanghai suddenly nodded, his expression now serious. He said something quietly to Richard that caused the millionaire to sit completely still. Around them the restaurant remained frozen in silent attention. Glasses sat untouched. Conversations had stopped. Even the kitchen door at the far end of the dining room hung half open as a waiter stared out in disbelief. Daniel Brooks felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood about his dining room. The quiet Maid he had treated like background furniture had just stepped into the center of a multi-million-dollar negotiation and changed the direction of it with a few calm sentences. Richard Whitmore looked at Naomi Carter for several long seconds. Then he asked one final question in English. "Miss Carter, where exactly did you learn Mandarin like that?" Naomi glanced down briefly at the cloth still folded in her hand. When she looked back up, her eyes were steady. "That answer," she said softly, "is a much longer story than you might expect." The restaurant remained wrapped in a strange quiet after Naomi Carter spoke those final words. Even the low music drifting from hidden speakers seemed softer now, as if the room itself were listening. Richard Whitmore rested both hands on the table, his fingers loosely folded together while he studied her. The man had spent his entire career reading people. He had negotiated with ministers, billion-dollar investors, and corporate lawyers who could twist language into knots. Yet the woman standing near the marble counter did not move like someone pretending to understand something beyond her reach. She stood with the calm of someone who knew exactly what she had heard and exactly why she had spoken. Daniel Brooks felt his throat tighten as he stepped closer to the table. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption. Miss Carter is part of the evening cleaning staff. She should not have involved herself in a private conversation." His voice carried the careful politeness of someone trying desperately to control a situation that had already slipped away. Richard Whitmore did not look at him. His attention remained fixed on Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "earlier you mentioned that the explanation behind your language skills is a long story. I believe tonight we have time for a short version." Naomi hesitated, not from fear, but from the quiet calculation of someone deciding how much truth to share in a room full of strangers. The cloth in her hand was still folded neatly, though her fingers had tightened slightly around the fabric. "I studied Mandarin in college, sir," she answered. The words sounded simple, but the effect inside the dining room was immediate. Daniel Brooks blinked in confusion. College. The idea did not match the image he had built in his mind of the quiet woman who wiped tables after guests left. Richard tilted his head slightly. "Many students study languages," he said calmly. "Very few speak them with that level of precision." Naomi allowed a faint breath to leave her chest. "That is because I did not only study it in class. I spent 2 years living in Beijing while completing an international business program." The man from Shanghai leaned forward at once, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition. In Mandarin, he asked her which university had hosted the exchange program. Naomi answered smoothly in the same language. The man nodded slowly, clearly impressed. Around them, the nearby guests began whispering quietly to one another, sensing that the story unfolding at the center table was far more interesting than the meals in front of them. Daniel Brooks could feel his confidence collapsing piece by piece. Naomi Carter, the woman he had repeatedly reminded to stay out of sight during busy evenings, had apparently lived overseas studying international business. The thought made his stomach twist with disbelief. Richard Whitmore leaned back again in his chair, considering this new information. Then he asked a question that hung heavily in the air. If you studied international business and Mandarin in Beijing, why are you working here cleaning tables? Naomi did not answer immediately. For the first time since the conversation began, her eyes shifted slightly toward the polished floor, catching the reflection of the chandelier above them. The golden light trembled across the marble surface like water. When she finally looked up again, her voice remained steady. Life does not always move in straight lines, sir. My mother became very sick shortly after I returned to the United States. I had to leave my job to take care of her. Hospital bills do not wait for careers to recover. The words were not dramatic. She spoke them quietly, without bitterness, as if describing the weather on a cloudy day. The man from Shanghai lowered his gaze respectfully. Richard Whitmore remained silent for several seconds. Daniel Brooks suddenly felt something unfamiliar creeping into the atmosphere of the room. It was not shock anymore. It was the beginning of respect. And that realization unsettled him more than anything else that had happened tonight. Richard Whitmore did not speak for several seconds after Naomi Carter finished explaining why she had left her previous career. The quiet inside the restaurant had deepened into something heavier now, something thoughtful. The wealthy guests who had originally been focused on expensive meals and quiet conversations were now watching the exchange unfolding at the center table. Some leaned slightly in their chairs. Others pretended to sip wine while their attention stayed fixed on Naomi. The shift in the room was impossible to ignore. Richard finally exhaled slowly and rested his arm along the back of his chair. I have spent my entire career negotiating across continents, he said calmly. I have hired translators, analysts, and consultants who charge more for 1 hour of work than most people earn in a week. Yet you understood a contract discussion that even experienced executives struggle to follow. His voice remained level, but the respect in his tone had begun to replace the quiet arrogance from earlier. Daniel Brooks stood frozen beside the table, trying to maintain the professional posture expected of a restaurant manager, but inside his thoughts were racing. A few minutes earlier, he had been preparing to scold Naomi for interrupting a guest. Now the same guest was speaking to her like an equal participant in a business conversation worth millions of dollars. The change in the balance of the room made Daniel feel like the ground had shifted beneath his polished shoes. Richard leaned slightly forward again and placed his hands on the table. Earlier you mentioned that the clause in our agreement could create financial liability for my company, he said. Explain exactly what you heard. Naomi paused, aware that every person in the dining room seemed to be listening. The soft hum of the restaurant kitchen echoed faintly in the distance. She stepped a little closer to the table so she would not need to raise her voice. In Mandarin, you described the clause as an adjustment provision tied to regulatory review, she said calmly. But the phrasing actually transfers responsibility for any post-agreement dispute to the acquiring party. That means if the partnership fails due to hidden financial issues, your company would absorb the entire loss. The man from Shanghai immediately nodded, his face growing serious. He spoke quickly to Richard in Mandarin again, pointing toward the printed document resting beside the wine glass. Richard picked up the folder and flipped several pages with careful attention. His eyes moved slowly across the lines of text. A few moments passed in silence. Then Richard stopped turning pages. His jaw tightened slightly as he reread the section Naomi had described. Daniel Brooks could feel the tension growing like pressure inside a sealed room. Richard Whitmore was not a man known for being easily misled. Yet the subtle wording Naomi had identified was buried deep within technical language. Without someone fluent in both the language and the structure of international agreements, it would have been easy to overlook. Richard finally closed the folder and placed it gently back on the table. For the first time that evening, his expression carried something close to humility. Miss Carter, he said quietly, if what you are saying is correct, then you may have just saved my company from a very expensive mistake. Naomi did not smile or react dramatically. She simply nodded once. I only spoke because the meaning was clear when I heard it, sir. The man from Shanghai looked between them with open admiration now. He spoke again in Mandarin, this time praising Naomi for recognizing a complex contractual risk so quickly. Several guests nearby exchanged surprised glances as the tension that had once centered on embarrassment began transforming into something entirely different. Respect was spreading through the room like quiet sunlight. Daniel Brooks felt his face growing warm with a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. For weeks, he had instructed Naomi Carter to remain invisible during service hours. Now the most powerful man in the room was listening to her more carefully than anyone else. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly and studied Naomi once again. You stepped into a conversation that had nothing to do with your job tonight, he said thoughtfully. Most people would have stayed silent. Naomi looked toward the polished marble floor for a brief moment before answering. Sometimes staying silent allows the wrong decision to happen, she said softly. And that answer left the room even quieter than before. The quiet that followed Naomi Carter's answer lingered like a held breath across the dining room. The words she had spoken were simple, yet the meaning behind them had settled deeply into the atmosphere. Sometimes staying silent allows the wrong decision to happen. Richard Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair again, his eyes still resting on Naomi with a thoughtful intensity that had replaced the casual authority he carried when he first arrived. For a man who built his reputation on controlling negotiations, tonight had taken a turn he had not expected. Across the table, his partner from Shanghai quietly turned the contract folder back toward Richard and tapped one line of text with a finger. Even from several feet away, Naomi could see the small paragraph he was pointing to. The clause she had heard spoken aloud only minutes earlier now sat clearly on the page, its meaning no longer hidden once someone knew exactly where to look. Richard read the paragraph again, slower this time. The restaurant lights reflected off the glossy paper as his eyes moved carefully across each word. Finally, he closed the folder once more. You realize this simply by overhearing our conversation, he said. Naomi nodded gently. The wording was familiar. Daniel Brooks felt his chest tighten again. The entire dining room was watching now. A few guests had returned to eating, but their attention continued drifting back toward the center table. Others whispered quietly to their companions, as if witnessing something rare. Daniel had spent years protecting the restaurant reputation, making sure wealthy guests felt superior, comfortable, and unquestioned. Yet tonight the hierarchy he relied on had cracked open in front of everyone. Richard rested his hands on the table and studied Naomi again. When you spoke earlier, you did not sound uncertain, he said. You sounded confident that the clause was dangerous. Naomi hesitated briefly before answering. When you work with international contracts long enough, certain patterns become easy to recognize. Richard raised one eyebrow slightly. You said earlier that you left your previous position because your mother became ill. Naomi nodded again. Yes, sir. Richard leaned forward slightly, curiosity growing in his voice. What company did you work for before returning home? Naomi took a quiet breath. The answer felt heavier than the earlier ones. I worked for a consulting firm that specialized in cross-border trade agreements between American and Chinese companies. The man from Shanghai immediately looked impressed. He spoke quickly in Mandarin, asking which firm. Naomi answered without hesitation. When Richard heard the name, his expression shifted again. The firm Naomi mentioned was not small. It was a respected consulting group known for advising major corporations on international regulatory compliance. Daniel Brooks nearly lost his balance where he stood. The realization struck him with embarrassing force. The woman he had treated like background staff had once worked in the same professional circles as some of the very clients who dined in his restaurant. Richard tapped his fingers once against the table as he considered everything he had just heard. Then he asked a quieter question. If you had that level of experience, why have you not returned to that field after your mother recovered? Naomi looked down at the marble floor again. The light from the chandelier shimmered across the surface like gentle water. My mother passed away last year, she said softly. After the hospital bills were settled, I did not have the resources to relocate or rebuild my career right away. The restaurant was hiring, and I needed steady work. Her voice held no trace of bitterness, only quiet honesty. Richard Whitmore remained silent for several seconds. Around them the dining room had grown calm again, Yet the energy in the room had changed. The quiet maid that had once been invisible was no longer invisible to anyone. Richard finally spoke again, his tone slower now. "Miss Carter, most people in this room would never have spoken up tonight." Naomi lifted her gaze and met his eyes. "I did not speak to impress anyone," she replied gently. "I spoke because I understood what was about to happen, and the truth was too clear to ignore." For several seconds after Naomi Carter spoke, Richard Whitmore did not move. The noise of the restaurant slowly returned in small, cautious sounds. A fork touched a plate. A chair shifted slightly. Somewhere near the kitchen, a glass clinked softly against another. Yet the center of the dining room remained still, as though the conversation at Richard Whitmore's table had quietly rewritten the rules of the room. Richard finally rested his elbows on the table and folded his hands together. His expression had changed completely from the confident businessman who had walked in earlier that evening. The arrogance had faded. What remained was something sharper and far more serious. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "I would like to understand something." Naomi stood calmly beside the table, the folded cloth still resting in her hand. "Yes, sir." Richard opened the contract folder again and slid it slightly toward the center of the table so Naomi could see the printed page. "Earlier you said the wording transfers the financial liability to my company if the deal collapses. If that is true, then someone wrote this clause very carefully." Naomi stepped a little closer, careful not to disturb the guests seated nearby. The paper reflected the warm light from the chandelier above them. She read the line again silently, even though she already knew it by memory. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "The wording appears neutral at first, but the structure shifts responsibility in a way that would only become obvious after a dispute begins." The man from Shanghai nodded slowly as he listened. His respect for Naomi was now visible to everyone watching. He spoke briefly in Mandarin, confirming that her explanation matched the legal interpretation he had begun to suspect himself. Richard leaned back again in his chair and studied Naomi with renewed interest. Daniel Brooks stood frozen a few feet away, his mind racing through everything he had witnessed during the past 15 minutes. The quiet employee he had barely acknowledged for weeks was now discussing international contract law with one of the most powerful clients who had ever stepped into the restaurant. The balance of authority in the room had shifted so completely that Daniel no longer knew where he belonged in the conversation. Richard finally closed the folder again with a soft sound. "Miss Carter," he said, "if that clause had gone unnoticed tonight, my company might have signed an agreement that could cost us tens of millions of dollars." Naomi did not react to the number. Her posture remained steady. "I only explained what the language suggested, sir." Richard watched her closely. "You did more than explain it. You prevented a mistake." The words hung quietly between them. Across the dining room, several guests had completely stopped pretending to eat. They were openly listening now, drawn into the unusual moment unfolding in front of them. Richard rested one hand on the table and glanced briefly at his partner from Shanghai before looking back at Naomi. "Tell me something honestly," he said. "When you heard us discussing the agreement earlier, you knew it was not your place to interrupt." Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." Richard tilted his head slightly. "Yet you spoke anyway." Naomi took a small breath before answering. "Because I recognized the language immediately. I have seen similar clauses used before when companies attempt to protect themselves during uncertain negotiations." Richard studied her expression carefully. "You understood that interrupting a conversation like that could cost you your job here." Naomi gave a faint thoughtful nod. "Yes, sir." Daniel Brooks felt his chest tighten at those words. Naomi continued speaking in the same calm tone. "But I also understood what might happen if nobody said anything." Silence settled over the table again. Richard Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair and looked at her with something that now resembled admiration rather than curiosity. "Many people stay silent when the truth is inconvenient," he said quietly. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Sometimes the truth is inconvenient because nobody wants to be the first person to speak it aloud." And that answer left Richard Whitmore staring at her with a thoughtful expression that suggested the evening had just become far more interesting than any business deal he had planned to discuss. The quiet around Richard Whitmore's table had turned into something almost electric. The soft glow of the chandelier above reflected across polished plates and glasses, but nobody at the surrounding tables seemed interested in their meals anymore. Every pair of eyes drifted back toward Naomi Carter standing beside the marble counter and the billionaire seated across from her. The moment had become larger than the restaurant itself. Richard Whitmore rested his hand against the edge of the table and studied Naomi with a thoughtful calm that had replaced his earlier confidence. "You realize the risk immediately," he said. Naomi nodded slightly. "Yes, sir." Richard tapped the closed contract folder once with his finger. The faint sound echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. Most of the attorneys who review documents like this take hours to notice what you recognized in a single conversation. Naomi did not respond right away. She understood that every word spoken now carried weight far beyond the restaurant floor. Sometimes when you hear the language spoken naturally, the intention becomes clearer than when you read it silently, she said gently. The man from Shanghai nodded again, clearly impressed by the explanation. He spoke briefly in Mandarin, praising Naomi's ability to recognize hidden meaning inside legal phrasing. Several guests nearby exchanged surprised glances as the conversation continued. Daniel Brooks stood a few steps away with his hands clasped tightly in front of him, trying to maintain the composure expected of a restaurant manager, but his thoughts were spinning with embarrassment. For weeks, he had reminded Naomi Carter to keep her head down and avoid speaking to high-profile guests, unless absolutely necessary. Yet now the most powerful man in the room seemed more interested in listening to her than anyone else present. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair and looked around the dining room for a moment. The quiet attention from the surrounding tables did not seem to bother him. In fact, it almost appeared as though he welcomed it. When he looked back at Naomi, his voice was calmer, more deliberate. "Miss Carter, earlier tonight you saved my company from a mistake that could have cost tens of millions of dollars." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. "I only shared what I understood, sir." Richard shook his head slowly. "No, you did more than that. You chose to speak when silence would have been easier." The sentence lingered in the air like a quiet acknowledgement of courage. Daniel Brooks felt his throat tighten again. He had watched many business conversations take place in this restaurant over the years. Wealthy people discussing deals, partnerships, investments. Yet he had never seen one of those conversations shift direction because of a person who arrived with a cleaning cloth in her hand. Richard rested his forearms on the table and leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something honestly, Miss Carter." Naomi looked up. "Yes, sir." Richard studied her expression carefully. "If you had stayed silent tonight, nobody here would have known that clause was dangerous. You could have continued your work, finished your shift, and walked home without anyone questioning you." Naomi listened quietly. Richard continued speaking. "Yet you chose to interrupt a conversation between two business partners discussing a deal worth more money than most people will ever see in their lifetime." He paused, then asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment she first spoke Mandarin across the room. "Why?" The entire dining room seemed to hold its breath again. Naomi Carter stood very still for a moment. The cleaning cloth remained folded in her hand, but the weight of the moment rested far beyond that simple object. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and sincere. "Because knowledge carries responsibility." Richard Whitmore tilted his head slightly. Naomi continued quietly. "If you recognize a mistake that could harm someone, and you choose to stay silent, then the silence becomes part of the mistake." A soft murmur moved through the nearby tables as several guests exchanged thoughtful looks. The words had landed with a quiet power that nobody expected from the woman who had entered the room earlier as part of the cleaning staff. Richard Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair again, studying Naomi Carter with a new level of respect. And in that moment it became clear to everyone watching that the quiet maid standing beside the marble counter was no longer the least important person in the room. For a long moment after Naomi Carter finished speaking, nobody at Richard Whitmore table moved. The words "knowledge carries responsibility" seemed to settle into the air like a quiet weight that every person in the room could feel. Even the background music from the restaurant speakers felt distant now, as though the building itself had paused to listen. Richard Whitmore studied Naomi with a slow, thoughtful expression that was very different from the confident businessman who had entered the restaurant earlier that evening. Across from him, the partner from Shanghai watched Naomi with open admiration. Daniel Brooks remained standing a few feet away, his hands still clasped tightly together, unsure whether he was supposed to step in or simply remain silent. In all his years managing the dining room, he had never seen a situation like this unfold. Finally, Richard leaned forward slightly and rested his forearms on the table. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "I would like to ask you something that goes beyond the contract itself." Naomi nodded politely. "Yes, sir." Richard glanced briefly at the closed folder containing the agreement that had almost been signed only minutes earlier. Then he looked back at Naomi. "When you heard our conversation tonight, you clearly understood the language, the legal structure, and the financial consequences. That means you recognized immediately how valuable that knowledge could be." Naomi listened quietly. Richard continued speaking, his tone thoughtful rather than accusatory. "Many people in your situation might have chosen a different path. They might have waited until the agreement was signed, then used that knowledge later for personal advantage." Naomi remained still, but the question behind his words was clear to everyone listening. "Why did you not do that?" A soft murmur moved through the surrounding tables as several guests leaned slightly closer to hear her answer. Naomi took a small breath before replying. "Because information like that is not a weapon," she said quietly. "It is a responsibility." Richard watched her carefully. Naomi continued. "When someone shares knowledge during a conversation, even if they do not realize who else might understand it, that knowledge carries trust. Using it to harm them later would be dishonest." The man from Shanghai nodded again, clearly impressed by her reasoning. Daniel Brooks felt another wave of disbelief move through him. For weeks, he had assumed Naomi Carter was simply quiet because she lacked confidence. Now he realized she had been quiet because she had never needed to prove anything to anyone in the room. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair, absorbing her words. He looked around the restaurant again, noticing the way nearly every guest had paused to observe the exchange. Instead of appearing annoyed by the attention, he seemed almost amused by the unusual moment. When his gaze returned to Naomi, there was a trace of admiration in his expression that had not been there before. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "do you realize what you could be doing with the skills you demonstrated tonight?" Naomi gave a small thoughtful nod. "Yes, sir." Richard tilted his head slightly. "Yet you are working late shifts cleaning tables in a restaurant." Naomi looked toward the marble floor again for a brief moment before answering. "Sometimes rebuilding a life takes longer than people expect," she said softly. "When my mother became ill, I stepped away from everything else. After she passed away, I needed work that was steady and immediate. The restaurant offered that." Her voice remained calm, without any hint of self-pity. Richard Whitmore remained silent for several seconds, considering the honesty in her words. Then he reached forward and placed his hand gently on the contract folder once more. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "tonight you may have prevented a mistake that would have changed the direction of a major business deal." Naomi did not respond. Richard continued speaking slowly. "But what interests me even more is not what you said about the contract. It is why you said it." Naomi looked up again, meeting his eyes. "Because it was the right thing to do," she answered simply. And as those words settled into the room, the quiet respect that had been building throughout the restaurant deepened even further. The words "because it was the right thing to do" seemed to echo softly through the dining room lawn. After Naomi Carter finished speaking, Richard Whitmore remained still for several seconds, his gaze steady on her face. In the warm light of the chandelier, his expression had changed again, shifting from curiosity into something deeper and more reflective. Around them, the quiet attention of the restaurant had not faded. Guests who had once arrived expecting a quiet dinner now sat silently, observing a moment that felt far more meaningful than any business conversation they had overheard before. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair and rested one arm across the backrest while his other hand remained on the table near the closed contract folder. His partner from Shanghai watched Naomi with the same thoughtful respect that had been building since she first spoke Mandarin across the room. Daniel Brooks stood nearby with an uneasy stiffness, aware that the balance of the evening had turned in a direction he could never have predicted. Richard finally broke the silence. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "throughout my career I have worked with consultants who were extremely talented. Many of them were highly educated and experienced in international negotiations. Yet talent alone does not always determine who I trust in a room like this." Naomi listened quietly. Richard continued speaking in a calm, measured tone. "What interests me most tonight is not simply that you recognize the clause in that agreement. It is the judgment you showed in choosing to speak." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly in acknowledgement, but did not interrupt. Richard glanced once more at the contract folder before pushing it gently aside. That document will be reviewed again tomorrow by my legal team, he said. But the decision to pause the agreement tonight happened because of you. Naomi remained calm, though she could feel the attention of the entire dining room resting on her shoulders. She had never imagined standing in the center of a room full of wealthy strangers discussing international contracts. Yet in that moment, she felt strangely steady, as if everything she had studied and experienced had quietly led her to this exact conversation. Richard leaned forward again slightly. Tell me something honestly, Miss Carter. Naomi looked up. Yes, sir. Richard folded his hands together. Do you believe you still have the skills to work in international consulting? The question hung in the air with unexpected weight. Daniel Brooks blinked in surprise. Even the man from Shanghai looked curious about Naomi's answer. Naomi considered the question carefully before speaking. Skills like language and contract analysis do not disappear easily, she said gently. But returning to that field would require opportunity and time to rebuild connections. Richard nodded slowly as though he had expected that answer. Opportunity, he repeated quietly. He looked at Naomi for another long moment before speaking again. Sometimes opportunity appears in unusual places. Naomi felt the meaning behind his words, but remained silent. Richard Whitmore then reached inside the pocket of his suit jacket and removed a simple business card. The small white card looked almost ordinary compared to the luxurious setting around them. Yet everyone watching understood that it carried a different kind of power. Richard placed the card carefully on the table between them. Miss Carter, he said calmly, tomorrow morning my office will be reviewing the entire structure of this agreement. I would value the opinion of someone who noticed the problem before anyone else in the room. Naomi looked down at the card, but did not reach for it immediately. The room had grown so quiet that even the faint hum of the air conditioning system could be heard. Richard continued speaking. If you are willing, I would like you to visit my office tomorrow and review the document with my team. The man from Shanghai nodded approvingly, as if the decision made perfect sense. Daniel Brooks felt his pulse quicken as the meaning of the moment became clear. The woman he had treated like an invisible employee was now being invited into a meeting that involved a deal worth millions of dollars. Naomi Carter slowly lifted her eyes to meet Richard Whitmore's gaze again. For the first time that evening, a faint smile touched her expression, not of triumph, but of quiet gratitude. Thank you, sir, she said softly. I would be honored to help. And with those words, the quiet maid who had entered the restaurant unnoticed had just stepped across a doorway that nobody in the room would soon forget. Naomi Carter stood quietly for a moment after accepting the invitation. The small white business card still rested on the table between her and Richard Whitmore, illuminated by the soft chandelier light. Around them, the restaurant had slowly begun returning to its usual rhythm, though the atmosphere remained subtly changed. Conversations resumed in low voices. Plates were lifted. Wine glasses touched the table again. Yet many guests still glanced toward the center table, aware that they had just witnessed something unusual. Richard Whitmore watched Naomi carefully, as if measuring the calm confidence she carried even while standing in a cleaning uniform beside a table of executives. Most people placed in her position would have reacted with excitement or disbelief. Naomi simply nodded with quiet respect. Richard appreciated that more than she realized. His partner from Shanghai leaned slightly forward and spoke to Richard in Mandarin. The tone of his voice carried approval, almost amusement. Richard answered him briefly in the same language before turning back to Naomi. Miss Carter, he said, tomorrow will not be a formal interview. Naomi listened attentively. Richard continued. I simply want you to sit with my legal team and review the structure of this agreement. If your instincts about the clause are correct, then you may have noticed something others missed. Naomi nodded once. I understand, sir. Richard studied her expression carefully. You are aware that the discussion tomorrow will involve people who have spent decades in corporate law and international trade. Naomi answered calmly. That does not worry me. Richard raised one eyebrow with faint curiosity. Why not? Naomi glanced briefly toward the contract folder on the table before replying. Because experience is valuable, but clarity is just as important. Sometimes people who work inside a system for many years stop questioning the language they see every day. The man from Shanghai laughed softly at that remark, clearly entertained by the accuracy of her observation. Richard Whitmore smiled faintly as well. Daniel Brooks felt another wave of disbelief pass through him as he listened. The conversation no longer resembled anything that should have happened between a restaurant employee and a billionaire client. Yet somehow Naomi Carter held her place in the exchange with calm confidence. Richard slowly stood from his chair. The movement caused several guests nearby to glance over again. When a man like Richard Whitmore rose from a table, people usually expected the evening to end. Instead, he extended his hand toward Naomi. Naomi hesitated only briefly before placing the folded cleaning cloth on the marble counter and accepting the handshake. Richard's grip was firm but respectful. "Thank you for speaking tonight," he said quietly. Naomi met his gaze. "Thank you for listening." The simplicity of the exchange seemed to surprise several people nearby. In a room filled with wealth and influence, the moment felt grounded in something far simpler. Richard released her hand and reached for his coat draped over the back of the chair. "My assistant will expect you at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," he said as he slipped the coat over his shoulders. "The address is printed on the card." Naomi nodded again. "I will be there." The man from Shanghai also stood and gave Naomi a respectful nod before gathering the contract folder. Their discussion in Mandarin continued quietly as they prepared to leave. Daniel Brooks watched them move toward the exit with a strange mixture of awe and embarrassment. The quiet employee he had overlooked for weeks had just walked directly into an opportunity that could change her entire future. As Richard Whitmore reached the entrance of the restaurant, he paused briefly and turned back toward Naomi one last time. "Miss Carter," he said calmly. Naomi looked up. Richard's voice carried a tone that everyone nearby could hear. "Talent is valuable, but integrity is far more rare." Then he gave her a final nod before stepping out into the cool night air of Manhattan. Naomi Carter remained standing beside the marble counter holding the small white card in her hand, aware that the simple decision to speak earlier that evening had quietly opened a door she never expected to see. For a few moments after Richard Whitmore stepped out into the Manhattan night, Naomi Carter remained standing exactly where she was. The small white business card rested between her fingers, its smooth surface catching the warm reflection of the chandelier above. Around her the restaurant slowly returned to motion, but the atmosphere felt different now, as though everyone present had quietly witnessed the same unexpected turning point. Several guests who had been watching the exchange returned to their conversations, though their voices remained softer than before. Others offered Naomi brief, respectful glances as they passed, recognizing that the quiet employee they had barely noticed earlier in the evening had just become the center of a story they would likely remember long after dinner ended. Daniel Brooks stood near the entrance of the dining room, still trying to process everything that had happened. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he walked slowly back toward Naomi, his polished shoes making faint sounds against the marble floor. Naomi noticed his approach and folded the business card carefully into her hand before turning to face him. Daniel cleared his throat as though preparing to deliver a formal instruction. Instead, he hesitated. "Miss Carter," he said finally, "I did not expect tonight to unfold the way it did." Naomi gave a small calm nod. "Neither did I." Daniel looked at the card she held, and then glanced toward the restaurant doors where Richard Whitmore had disappeared only minutes earlier. "You realize that invitation was not small," he said. Naomi nodded again. "Yes." Daniel shifted his weight uncomfortably. For weeks he had spoken to her in the firm tone managers often used with cleaning staff, reminding her to stay out of sight and avoid drawing attention during service hours. Now the memory of those instructions felt embarrassingly misplaced. "I suppose I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Naomi looked at him with mild surprise. Daniel continued, choosing his words carefully. "I assumed you were simply another employee trying to get through a shift. I did not know about your background or your education." Naomi answered with gentle honesty. Most people here did not ask. Daniel gave a short, thoughtful nod. That answer carried more meaning than he expected. For the first time that evening, he saw Naomi not as a quiet worker moving through the dining room, but as someone who had simply been passing through a difficult chapter of life. The restaurant lights reflected softly in the polished marble around them as the final guests of the evening finished their meals. Daniel glanced once more at the card in her hand. "Are you going to meet him tomorrow?" he asked. Naomi considered the question only briefly. "Yes," she said calmly. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then he gave her a small, respectful nod that carried none of the authority he had used earlier in the evening. In that moment, the distance between manager and employee seemed to fade, replaced by something closer to simple human respect. "Well," he said quietly, "I suppose tomorrow may look very different for you than tonight did." Naomi allowed herself a faint, thoughtful smile. "Perhaps." Daniel turned toward the dining room to continue overseeing the closing procedures, but he paused before walking away. "Miss Carter," he said over his shoulder. Naomi looked up. "I hope the opportunity leads you somewhere better than cleaning tables in my restaurant." Naomi watched him for a moment before replying softly. "Every place teaches something valuable, even this one." Daniel gave one final nod before stepping away. Naomi Carter remained beside the marble counter, holding the small white card in her hand. Outside the tall windows of the restaurant, the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the night skyline. She knew that tomorrow morning she would step into a world she had once believed was permanently behind her. Yet the strange truth of the evening remained clear in her mind. She had not spoken because she hoped for opportunity. She had spoken because it was the right thing to do. And sometimes doing the right thing quietly opened doors that no one could have predicted. The restaurant finally grew quiet as the last guests finished their meals and the staff began the slow routine of closing the dining room. Chairs were lifted onto tables one by one, and the warm lights dimmed slightly as the evening came to an end. Naomi Carter remained near the marble counter for a few moments longer, the small white business card still resting gently in her hand. The events of the evening replayed in her mind with quiet clarity. Only a short time earlier, she had been moving silently between tables with a cleaning cloth, hoping to finish her shift without drawing attention. Now she stood holding an invitation that could reopen a career she believed had disappeared forever. Outside the tall windows of the restaurant, the city of Manhattan shimmered with late-night traffic and glowing office towers. Naomi placed the card carefully inside the pocket of her jacket and began helping the remaining staff finish their closing tasks. She wiped down the last polished surfaces, stacked clean glasses behind the bar, and returned the folded cloths to their storage shelf. The familiar routine grounded her thoughts. Daniel Brooks occasionally glanced in her direction while overseeing the final details of the evening, though he said nothing further. The earlier conversation had shifted something in him as well. By the time the clock above the kitchen doorway reached nearly 11 o'clock, the restaurant lights were lowered and the front doors were unlocked for the final staff to leave. Naomi gathered her coat and stepped outside into the cool night air. The city smelled faintly of rain and passing taxis. She paused on the sidewalk for a moment, looking down at the quiet street before beginning the short walk toward the subway station. As she walked, the sounds of Manhattan surrounded her. Distant horns echoed through the avenues. Footsteps moved past in quick rhythms. The entire city seemed alive with motion and possibility. Yet Naomi walked calmly, her thoughts steady. She knew tomorrow morning would bring a very different environment than the restaurant dining room. The office of Richard Whitmore would be filled with lawyers, analysts, and professionals who had spent years navigating the complicated world of international finance. The idea might have intimidated many people, but Naomi had once worked inside that same world. She had studied the language, the agreements, and the negotiations that shaped global trade. Those skills had never truly disappeared. They had simply waited quietly beneath the surface while life demanded her attention elsewhere. When she reached the subway entrance, she paused again, resting her hand lightly against the railing. The business card remained safely in her pocket. For a moment, she thought about the hospital rooms where she had spent long nights caring for her mother, the paperwork that had slowly drained her savings, and the difficult months after her mother passing when she had accepted whatever work was available simply to stay afloat. None of those experiences felt wasted now. They had shaped the calm patience she carried with her tonight. Naomi descended the subway stairs and boarded the nearly empty train heading toward her apartment. The ride through the underground tunnels gave her time to reflect on how quickly an ordinary evening had transformed. A conversation overheard by chance had led to a decision that might change the direction of her future. Yet the truth remained simple. She had not spoken because she hoped to gain something. She had spoken because she believed honesty mattered more than convenience. As the train slowed near her stop, Naomi stepped onto the platform and began the short walk home. Above ground, the night sky stretched over the city lights, quiet and steady. Tomorrow morning, she would walk into a corporate office instead of a restaurant dining room. But the person walking through that door would still be the same woman who had chosen to speak when silence would have been easier. And that quiet certainty gave her more confidence than any opportunity ever could. The next morning arrived, quietly over Manhattan as the early sunlight reflected off the glass towers lining the avenues. Naomi Carter stepped out of the subway station with calm determination and walked the final block toward the tall office building printed on the white business card. The building rose high above the street, its polished entrance framed by wide glass doors and a row of flags that moved gently in the morning breeze. People in dark suits passed through the lobby with quick, confident steps, their conversations filled with the language of business and numbers. Naomi paused briefly on the sidewalk before entering, not because she felt afraid, but because she understood the meaning of the moment. Only 12 hours earlier, she had been wiping tables in a restaurant dining room. Now she was about to walk into the headquarters of one of the most influential investment firms in the city. She stepped inside the lobby and approached the reception desk, where a polite assistant looked up from a computer screen. Naomi introduced herself and explained that she had been invited to meet Richard Whitmore. The assistant nodded immediately as though expecting her arrival. "Please take the elevator to the 27th floor," she said with a welcoming smile. "They are waiting for you." Naomi thanked her and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, the quiet hum of the elevator carried her upward through the building. When the doors opened again, the hallway beyond revealed a conference room surrounded by glass walls overlooking the city skyline. Inside the room, several attorneys and financial analysts sat around a large table covered with documents and laptops. At the head of the table, Richard Whitmore looked up as Naomi entered. His expression held the same calm respect he had shown the night before. "Miss Carter," he said, "thank you for coming." Naomi took a seat at the table and the meeting began. For the next hour, the room filled with detailed discussion about the agreement that had nearly been signed. Lawyers reviewed the clause Naomi had recognized and confirmed that her interpretation had been correct. The language would have placed the entire financial burden of a failed partnership onto Richard Whitmore Company. Several of the attorneys admitted that the clause had been written in a way designed to appear harmless unless someone examined it with both linguistic and contractual understanding. Naomi listened carefully, occasionally offering small clarifications in Mandarin when the wording required it. The professionals in the room quickly realized that her insight the night before had not been luck. She understood the structure of the agreement as clearly as any consultant in the building. When the review ended, Richard Whitmore closed the folder and looked around the table. "It appears we avoided a very expensive lesson," he said calmly. Then he turned toward Naomi. "Miss Carter, you demonstrated both knowledge and integrity. Those qualities are rare in any profession." He reached across the table and placed another document in front of her. It was a formal consulting offer for a position within his international advisory team. The salary was more than Naomi had earned in several years combined. Naomi read the page quietly before looking up again. Richard Whitmore spoke gently. "This opportunity is yours if you wish to accept it." Naomi thought for a moment before nodding with quiet gratitude. "I would be honored to contribute," she said. Several people in the room smiled as the agreement was finalized. Later that afternoon, Naomi stepped outside the building into the sunlight of the busy city street. The future ahead of her looked very different than it had the night before. Yet the lesson of the story remained simple. Naomi Carter had not changed the world with power or wealth. She had changed it with honesty and courage in a moment when it would have been easier to stay silent. And sometimes that is enough to remind everyone in the room what true integrity looks like.